I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do.
Excuse me, Laurie.
Oh, Mr. Brackett, I'm sorry, Mr. Brackett.
Oh, I didn't mean to startle you.
That's all right.
You know, it's Halloween. I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we're continuing our spooky season series, this time with a Hollywood tragedy and true crime caper that is stranger than fiction. I'm talking about the 1982 Twilight Zone Deaths. If you're unfamiliar, Steven Spielberg, along with a few other filmmakers, including Joe Dante and John Landis, who will be central to this episode, adapted a few episodes of Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone into a movie. Tragedy struck on set, however, leaving actor Vic Morrow and 2 children dead in the process. It led to one of the biggest Hollywood scandals at the time, and usually gets brought up in conversations about Hollywood tragedies that have happened since, such as the death of Brandon Lee on the set of The Crow, and the recent case of Alec Baldwin and the movie Rust. Joining us to discuss this case is journalist Steve Chane, author of Fly By Night: The Secret Story of Steven Spielberg, Warner Brothers, and the Twilight Zone Deaths. And he has a lot to say about this case and argues that there was a cover-up of criminal negligence on the set of the Twilight Zone movie. If you're unfamiliar with this story, buckle up because this is a wild one. So with that being said, let's get right to it with Steve Chane. But before we do that, I almost forgot. I need to remind you that this show is listener funded, with the exception, of course, of my one sponsor, the mighty Mike Swanson of WallStreetWindow.com. Other than him, it's you, the listener, that makes this show possible. So if you can, head on over to patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And if you can, kick me some cash. I could really use it to keep this show going. And also visit my sponsor, Mike Swanson's website, wallstreetwindow.com, for the best financial and trading news. He has a great newsletter, and if you sign up to it, you can get a copy of his free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. Really worth reading. Along with the newsletter, I've had listeners get return on investment from Sorry, got tongue-tied there. I've had listeners actually make return on investment from some of Mike's trading tips. So head on over to wallstreetwindow.com if that's of interest to you. And really, I can't recommend wallstreetwindow.com enough. And with that being said, let's get right to it with Steve Chane on the Twilight Zone Deaths. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm really, really excited to speak with about a very interesting case in sort of what I would call the world of Hollywood Babylon, the world of Hollywood scandals and crime. Steve Chane, author of Fly By Night:
the secret story of Steven Spielberg, Warner Brothers, and the Twilight Zone Deaths. How are you doing today?
Very good. Thank you.
So, Steve, before we get into your book, Fly By Night, maybe we could talk a little bit about your background, because you have an interesting story yourself. You worked for the great countercultural magazine, Ramparts, and I'm just wondering, how did you transition from Ramparts? And I hear at one point you even were a colleague of Hunter S. Thompson's to investigating the Twilight Zone case.
Well, as you know, the Ramparts itself was a product of the 60s, and principally the war in Vietnam was the main subject. It was supported by the progressives of the time who opposed the war. And once the war was over, and Ramparts went out of business before the war was over, but once the war was over, all the political conditions kind of changed in America and went back to normal to a certain extent. And we basically, people who worked there had to pursue professional careers in journalism or publishing elsewhere. And basically we all spread out. As far as the Hunter Thompson period went, the leader of the Ramparts, a very big personality, a guy named Warren Hinkle, who was a very prominent San Francisco journalist at the time, was close drinking buddies with Thompson, and they spent a lot of time together. In fact, Warren is considered responsible for inventing, with Hunter Thompson, that whole field of so-called gonzo journalism, when Warren assigned Thompson to cover the Kentucky Derby or whatever the first kind of gonzo approach was applied to magazine publishing and whatnot. And so we all separated and went our separate ways. Of course, the Twilight Zone accident, this is the 40th anniversary for that horrible event. Many of your listeners probably aren't even familiar that it occurred because they weren't even born yet, but this is the 40th anniversary. And the interesting thing about it is many of the principals are still very active and very prominent in the Hollywood filmmaking, not the least of which, or of whom, is Steven Spielberg, who has never been tainted by this horribly bloody affair in which he and his staff and minions were involved. The book is really about how the studio, their lawyers, and a giant staff of people, including investigators and district attorneys, people, all these folks basically covered up the story and protected both Warner and Spielberg, and let the director the director who was accused of causing the accident, John Landis, take the rap.
So I guess a good place to start with this is, so when we're talking about the Twilight Zone movie, if people don't know, this movie was made in the 1980s, and it's an anthology movie, essentially, sort of like the old British Amicus horror anthologies of the 60s and 70s. So you have a few different directors working on their favorite different stories from the Twilight Zone. And I think the directors are Spielberg, Joe Dante, and then, of course, John Landis. And John Landis, his segment was basically a parable about racism. Maybe you could tell us just a little bit about the film itself and how it sort of came together, and Landis's segment in the film.
Well, as you know, this was a period of, like I said, 40 years ago, 1982. And the Twilight Zone, the movie, the anthology, as you described it accurately, was made in the wake or the immediate aftermath of the success of Spielberg. Of course, he had the giant success with Jaws, which put him big time on the map. And then, of course, came E.T., Close Encounters, Poltergeist, and they made Spielberg a giant. And during that period, he became friends with John Landis. They became both professional friends and social friends. And they would put each other in their movies in cameo roles. In the Blues Brothers, John Landis placed Spielberg in there as a clerk. In Spielberg's flop comedy attempt, 1941, John Landis was placed in there in a cameo role as some kind of a messenger boy. So, they were pretty close at the time. So when they landed this project, of course, Spielberg, everybody wanted to get a piece of Spielberg at the time. And he was basically making deals with different studios. He made E.T. with one studio, made the other Poltergeist with another. At this time, Warner Brothers, one of the major top three in Hollywood at the time, didn't have a Spielberg project, so they were all excited. And so they basically, I don't remember the details of who proposed this particular anthology approach, but when the anthology approach, obviously Twilight Zone was a giant success on television. And part of the movie process is, taking from television and converting to the big screen. So once this plan was made, Spielberg and Landis got into a sort of a competition rivalry about who could create the most, I guess, dramatic segment of the film. There were going to be 4 segments, and each one of them was to develop their own segment accordingly. Some would pick segments from the TV series and then recycle it for a movie application. In John Landis's case, thinking of himself as a brilliant genius, he wrote the whole section himself, which was actually initially rejected by the studio. And in the first series of submissions did not include any reference to children. It was only because the studio wanted to use the formula of arousing the viewer's sympathy by inserting children in the film.
So real quick, if I could, the segment in question that Landis directed, for people that don't know, and hopefully I'm recalling it correctly, but it's about this racist who ends up, I guess, being transported to different areas of time as a marginalized group in that setting and being discriminated against. And he's played by Vic Morrow. And what's really sad, one of the sad aspects of this case, along with the deaths of 2 innocent children, is the fact that this probably would have been Vic Morrow's big comeback movie. I mean, he used to be a big star back in the day, but his star had sort of waned, and this was going to be his big comeback. So how does it come together that they want to get children involved? That's, I think the figure of Lucy Fisher is involved with that, making that happen.
Right. Well, as I mentioned, the executive producer on the whole project was Steven Spielberg. And if you understand how film is organized or how a filmmaking is organized, there are different figures who perform different functions. And Spielberg had the Landis segment, and the others were being basically monitored by his closest associate at the time, a fellow named Frank Marshall, who was actually the highest ranking official on the set when the helicopter crashed. He was actually present at the time and played a big role in initiating the cover-up that lasted for 5 years. He never was interviewed, never appeared at evidence, and actually fled the scene the night of the accident. But apart from that, so Marshall was the direct liaison between Spielberg and the film. And one of the creative directors who worked for Warner Brothers Studio, who was the producer, was assigned to basically review the film's progress and the script and to determine whether it was acceptable or not. And it was through that process between the executive staff at Warner, I think John Daly, the president of Warner, was involved, Lucy Fisher, and then John Landis himself, who was the author, who was a screenwriter on this episode, felt that the way he first submitted it didn't work. It was too angry, too racist, actually, ironically, because it was intended to be a story about racism. Actually, it was
it's a story essentially about a guy who he transforms. Well, he starts out as a racist, and then he realizes that racism is wrong. Yeah.
Right. He's an anti-Semite more than being, specifically speaking. He misses being a job promotion, and he blames it on the Jews. So he's presented as this very brutal anti-Semitic figure who in the Twilight Zone is transformed into a Jew. And in that process has to undergo all of the persecution type things that a persecuted individual would experience as a result of racism. An encounter with the Ku Klux Klan, an encounter with the German troops in Nazi Germany. And then, of course, the final encounter where the accident occurs is where he's mistaken for a Viet Cong or a Vietnam episode, and he basically is mistaken for a guerrilla or a resistance to he's being hunted by American troops, and he attempts to rescue 2 children who he believes will be menaced by the American military. And in that scene, being pursued by the helicopter, the crash occurs.
Now, real quick, my understanding, just to clarify this for listeners, is that, the original script didn't have these children, but the studio wanted children in it because that, people identify with children and it'll create more empathy with the characters.
Right. Basically, the term that I use throughout the book, because it becomes sort of a thematic idea, is they wanted to soften the character, just as I use the term later to describe how John Landis's defense attorneys wanted to soften the witnesses to basically create a myth, or which was that he was innocent in the case of the trial, and in the case of the film, Vic Morrow would not be perceived. There would be a redemption would be created, rather than just this brutal racist character never have any redeeming qualities. And that would be the redemption was in the rescue of the children.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, and we'll get to this later, but I think you have one person say at the end of the trial, that you quote them as saying, it ended like a Capra movie. So there is this sort of softening going on, and this sort of, it's almost like everyone in Hollywood is viewing this through the lens of film and cinema. It's interesting.
Well, look, I don't want to give away the ending. I don't know if you had an opportunity to review it, but it has a Twilight Zone ending, which describes how the jury came to the very illogical conclusion that the defendants were innocent.
So for listeners that are younger, what happened on the set this night of the grisly deaths of these two children and Vic Morrow? And also, before we do that, I actually should get into this. These kids were on set when they weren't supposed to be, because it was filmed at night and there were labor laws in effect that should have prevented this, right?
This film, I mean, I don't know, I haven't investigated other films, but from the very beginning, everything about it was illegal, conspiratorial, and designed to be a disaster. For example, once the kids were finally incorporated into the script, John Landis and his partner, who was another defendant, a guy named George Folsey, who come from a very prominent filmmaking family in Hollywood himself, decided to film this thing because of his ultra desire for reality. They wanted to have the kids next to the explosions in the final scenes. When he first proposed to the casting agency to try and find him some kids, and they realized what his plans were, they declined, thinking that he was crazy, and told him so. In fact, one of the big lines in the book, one of the big reasons we claim that Warner and Frank Marshall and the executive authorities knew about Landis' plans from the very beginning, was because one of the leading witnesses in the trial, the casting director, this gal Marcy Leroff, actually called Frank Marshall directly and informed him of her concerns about John Landis's intention to place these children illegally at night next to explosives, which Frank Marshall never had to address because he fled the country for years to avoid being a witness. In any event, it was a scene where, so when they cut to the chase, when the kids were finally hired, they were hired from the very beginning with the illegal intents. When they brought them to the set, they discovered that a fire marshal on the set who was there to monitor the explosions was also a child safety official who worked for a child welfare department. By California law, these companies are required, when they use children in either television or motion pictures, to make an application to the state. There's a state board, and to have a child welfare official assigned to the set to preserve the safety of the child. Of course, they never did any such thing because, for one, they were going to be using the children at night, which itself was forbidden. So even had they applied, they would have been denied. And two, they were placing them in close proximity to live special effects explosions, lethal enough, we know now, that they were able to blow down a helicopter. So the idea that these special effects explosives were not dangerous to the children, which the Landis defense always held, which was ridiculous on its face, was false. So once the fire marshal was discovered on the set, the kids had to be hidden. Okay, Landis was so excited about the size of the explosions that he was boasting to everybody, hey, you got to be there to see it. So the night when the kids were brought to the set for the final shots, many people in the cast brought their children and family to see the explosions. It was going to be like a big, 4th of July type thing. And so the children didn't seem that out of place. The two Asian or Vietnamese children who perished, one was Chinese American, the other was Vietnamese. They didn't seem that out of place on the set. But in any event, once they discovered the location manager had worked with the fire marshal before, so he knew he was also a child welfare administrator. He immediately spotted him, went to Landis and others in the executive level of the film, or as they call them in the film world, the above the line people, and said, hey, there's a fire marshal on the set who's also, he's going to know right away. He's going to stop the production. So they came up with a scheme, a plot to hide the children until the final shot was ready and to bring them out and to move the fire marshal out of the site of the scene so that he would be confined far away, just checking out the long range. In any event, they had a massive conspiracy they hatched, which included John Landis, George Folsey, first assistant director, second assistant director, and a number of other above the line staff members. And they hid the children with John Landis's wife in the director's trailer. John Landis's wife, Deborah Nadoolman Landis, was the costume director on the film, another benefit of being married to the director. And she and others stayed with the children. Each child had a different parent there. The little girl had her mother there. The little boy had his father there. And they all stayed in the trailer until they were going to be called out. Anyway, filming went late that night, and like 2 or 3, 4 in the morning. So the kids never got to do the final scene. And many who know the story think that in all likelihood, the reason why it did go late is because the conspirators, Landis and his crew, never found an opportunity to bring the kids out to displace the fire marshal. So they kept hiding them and the chance never came. It was only on the next night where they delayed everything a full day that they were able to bring out the kids and hide them. And at the time of the shot, the fire marshal, who doubled as a child welfare, never even realized there were kids in the scene until he discovered the decapitated head of the little boy when they were following up on the crash to see what had occurred and whether there were any survivors.
Yeah, and just to clarify this point about the skirting of basic labor laws when it involves children, if there's people that aren't familiar with how Hollywood works, I can give an example here. The famous sitcom Full House. There was a reason they didn't have both Mary-Kate Olsen and Ashley Olsen as twins in it. They only had one playing the character in like each episode, and that's because there were regulations on how long you could have kids working on a set. So they would use both of them to play the same character. So it's amazing to me with the Twilight Zone movie, they really just completely skirted any child labor laws.
Well, one of the revelations in the book that never appeared in the trial or any of the reports about it afterwards was how the special effects chief, or was a guy, not the special effects, but the stunt chief on the set wanted to use either doubles for the children or like short people.
Oh, is this the whole thing about baby dummies? Gary McClarty, right? Okay, go on.
Gary McClarty, who's now deceased, who was one of the most difficult and unreachable witnesses, was a very close associate of Landis. Landis had him, he was his stunt chief in Blues Brothers, and they were very close, and they took great pride in the size of their explosions and the violence of their car crashes. And he never really participated or cooperated with authorities, evaded authorities throughout, never gave an interview to police. And he begged John Landis to use dummies that he brought. But John Landis was so insistent in wanting a close-up shot in the final scene to show that it was Vic Morrow holding real children that he rejected that and insisted that the real children be used, which itself was another violation of the child safety. Obviously, their presence was a violation. The conspiracy to keep them hidden from authorities was a violation, and of course, using them itself was a violation.
So what leads to this fateful helicopter crash for people that aren't familiar? Because I mean, you have people decapitated in this case. It's really a horrific, grisly case.
As I described earlier, the final scene, intended scene, was for Vic Morrow. He'd gone through the Nazi experience. He went through the Ku Klux Klan experience. The final scene for the real conversion or the redemption to occur was him to rescue these children while being pursued by American troops in Vietnam. That pursuit, the drama of the pursuit, the way Landis wrote that scene, was for a helicopter to be standing overhead with a giant spotlight, sunlight, focused on Vic Morrow and the kids, and explosions to occur while they cross the river and leave the scene.
Right, because it's during the Vietnam War, so you have
Correct.
explosions going on. Okay,
Correct.
go on.
And so there were a number of these explosions were all set for the final scene. And even in the setting of the explosions, they violated the rules and conspired. They put explosions where they weren't supposed to be. The fatal explosion, for example, was placed under a Vietnamese hut that wasn't supposed to be, the explosion was not supposed to be placed under any structure. That was one of the agreements they made when the fire application was made with the fire department for the special effects. They placed explosions everywhere carelessly, in my opinion, one of which was under the hut. There were like 10, 11 huts on a shoreline. This hut in the trial and in all of the forensics and whatever became known as hut number 4. So in hut number 4, they placed explosions under a wooden floor. When that explosion was detonated, the wooden floor projected or propelled debris at very high speeds underneath this hovering helicopter with the light focused on Vic and the kids, shattered the tail rotor, causing the helicopter to go into a spin and collapse on Vic Morrow and the kids, causing its horrible danger, which, as you know, decapitated the little boy, decapitated Vic Morrow, and crushed the little girl to death. This occurred in front of the little boy's father and the little girl's mother. They actually witnessed this thing, and they witnessed the remains of their poor dead children. So it was a really horrible, unbelievable sight.
And I guess we should say that. What was that?
If you can imagine the sight. And then on top of it all, I mean, I don't know where you're sitting now, but in California, if you have a motor vehicle accident, more than a few $100, you're supposed to report it to the police, blah, blah, blah. You know, they come out to the site, whatever. The executive producer on the film, Steven Spielberg's closest ally, with this fellow Frank Marshall, who himself went on to produce many things for Spielberg. Most of his successful things, Jurassic Park, all of the subsequent giant films. He actually fled the set with the parents and ordered that the set be cleared. In reverse of what a good citizen would seem to want to do, which is say, hey, don't touch anything, let's preserve the evidence. In exact opposition to that, he fled the set and ordered the second assistant director to call it a wrap and send everybody home, which resulted in the destruction of major evidence in the case, so that the authorities were never really able to ever put together the case, which I have done in the book.
So this
and one of the main,
us...
excuse me, I was going to say, in one of the main revelations of the book, it's a long story, so you have to kind of read the book. It's a complicated story. But one of the main objectives of the John Landis defense, once he was finally accused and charged with manslaughter, was to show that it was an accident and that John Landis was not directly responsible for igniting the fatal explosion that detonated hut number 4. And I prove in the book for the first time that John Landis was standing right next to the special effects individual who detonated that particular explosion. And it was at the direction of John Landis at the exact moment he wanted the helicopter, Vic Morrow and the kids in the final shot that he wanted. And the trial, according to trial testimony, it was not John Landis. And part of the cover-up was the creation out of whole cloth, in my opinion, by John Landis' very famous dead attorney, a guy named James Neal,
He was involved in Watergate.
Watergate prosecutor, defended Standard Oil when they had their oil leak that destroyed parts of Alaskan shore. He defended Elvis's doctor, who was accused of somehow being involved in Elvis's death. I don't know the case, but he was a real Jim Dandy from the South, a great attorney, actually. Did a great performance in front of that jury, obviously convinced them to acquit. But he completely created a false narrative and a false story to which one of the main witnesses in the trial affirmed in his testimony, which I allege is either perjury or, if not perjury, borders on perjury.
Can we get into this a little bit more in depth? I don't want to give away the whole book, but you're referring, I think, to a special effects man by the name of James Camomile, who basically said, "Oh, it was all my fault." But you're saying, right. I don't buy that. What do you think really happened then?
Well, I know what happened because I have the investigators' notes who interviewed people who told the truth, who were few and far between. When the crash first occurred, very few of the crew went to the authorities at all. A couple of guys were very upset, a couple of cameramen who had been chastised, ridiculed, and humiliated by Landis, they were interested in cooperating, but they didn't really have, they were cameramen, they didn't have a full knowledge. But the investigator, who was a guy named James Frasco, who was actually hired by the Landis defense, and this prominent prestige attorney worked with him, James Neal, interviewed all the principals on the set. And the way it went down, in my opinion, okay, the guy who set off the explosions, who was standing right next to, okay, picture it this way. It's all set up. The scene's set. There are 5 special effects guys on the scene. 2 of the special effects guys are responsible for the big explosions that are going to go off. Each one has a little board on which they can ignite the explosions. One guy has a board named James Camomile. He has the so-called A card. He can do anything, doesn't need supervision. The guy standing next to John Landis he's got the other detonator. So there are 2 guys. Each one of them on their board has specific explosions on the set. The guy running the John Landis board, right next to John Landis, Jerry Williams, has a B card. He's supposed to be doing it under the authority of an A card guy. The A card guy on the set, who should have been doing that, was a guy named Paul Stewart. He was one of the 5 defendants, chief of special effects. And according to observations by many on the set, including the investigator, Paul Stewart, basically they said the special effects truck looked like a bar on wheels. They were serving cocktails, vodka, beer. In fact, one of the first things that the investigator who came out to the scene found at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning was beer cans. As you know from the book, we called that chapter Cold to the Touch, which is what he wrote in his notebook about the beer cans. So they were obviously disposed. The special effects truck, the so-called bar on wheels, left the set within 20 minutes of the accident. They picked up evidence, threw it on the truck, and drove it back to Warner, never to be investigated by authorities because they disappeared with the evidence. So in any event, the explosions went off. And my allegation is that Jerry Williams, and the director at the bar on wheels. Paul Stewart was literally too drunk to operate the firing board. So he assigned Jerry Williams to do it, who seemed to be a little more in control. This is what many stated who observed. And the proof that Jerry Williams ignited the fatal fourth explosion was contained in the very first interviews, but the prosecution was so inept, they were not able to really discern what happened, never did, and accepted the defense argument that James Chamomile accidentally ignited that fatal explosion, which one, took away responsibility from Landis, and two, contributed to the narrative created out of whole cloth by James Neal that there was a plan on the final scene, and the plan went amiss because of an accident, sort of an act of God type defense. And of course, the jury bought it.
So just to clarify here, because I don't want people to misinterpret you. You're not, I know you're not making the argument that Landis and his people like deliberately wanted to see people die or anything. You're saying that they were criminally negligent in a way where, you know, this is more than just an accident.
Right, that he was told. Well, first of all, one of the defenses, another thing that went into the defense of the so-called plan, which was invented by James Neal, which was, you know, tantamount to lying in court, you know, claimed that there was a rehearsal. Okay, there was no rehearsal, okay, because you couldn't do a rehearsal. Why? Because the kids were there illegally, so you couldn't have them exposed. They couldn't leave the director's trailer until the very last minute. Okay, so one, and a rehearsal was impossible. Two, because Landis sought this final scene with the helicopter to get what directors call the shot, because he wanted to get this great shot, he never really consulted with experts. He never had the helicopter pilot, for example, have a conference with the special effects people about where the explosions would be, which would be routine protocol and mandatory. So, I mean, there were many things that were completely reckless, many of which had to do with John. And then many people claim that John Landis knew that Paul Stewart and the special effects crew were stoned or on alcohol and would be very malleable to his desires. And you got to remember too, this is 1982. Of all the great expensive years of cocaine use in Hollywood, this was the highlight year. This was the year that John Belushi died. This was the year that many Hollywood celebrities admitted using cocaine. They said that the cocaine was as easier to get as a sandwich from a catering truck, that there were actually cocaine trucks. And I never raised it in the book except for briefly, but in many police interviews, there was a mention of cocaine on the set, but the prosecution never made it part of the case for reasons I don't want to bother you with, but they never got into it. But both the hairdresser for Vic Morrow, who spent the last moments with him, and the makeup artist for Vic Morrow, who spent the last moments with him, claimed that Vic Morrow believed that John Landis was on cocaine or some kind of drug, and that he kept urging those two ladies to assure him that he wasn't, but never got final confirmation one way or the other. But he told both his attorney, Vic Morrow, before he died, and he told the hairdresser that he thought cocaine was rampant on the set.
I think now would be a good time to talk just briefly here about where the title of the book comes from, Fly By Night, because that sort of has a double meaning and it relates to something that was on set that was referred to as Fly By Night. Could you talk about that?
Well, another interesting part, I had mentioned earlier how this was an anthology, so there were going to be 4 parts to the film. And one of the tricks that independent producers who work for a studio use to get better bids on the various services and equipment they need is they give their company some kind of name that the crew can all enjoy, like JG Productions, whatever, so that no one knows they're actually Warner, Paramount, Universal. Because if you decide to rent a spotlight and you're from Warner, it's $1,000 a night. if you're an independent producer who needs some support, it's $300 a night. So these independent producers pick names. In the case of John Landis, as I mentioned earlier, it was a competition between him and Spielberg to see who could bring in the best, most dramatic segment for the least amount of money. And as I mentioned earlier, Landis had his $1 million budget that he couldn't exceed without losing Final Cut. So when he was so proud of the fact that he could cut corners and cheat, that he arrogantly and in a way very revealingly named his little company Fly By Night. So when it finally come to incorporating the helicopter in the scene, as you know, many military aircraft and military conduct, airplanes, helicopters, they'll put some kind of image on the side, lady in a bikini called Naked One, whatever. They come up, you've seen these in the films, sort of a tradition in the military. So since this was a military helicopter, Landis, in his humorous, self-mocking way, had the nose of the helicopter painted with his production company name, Fly By Night, with a picture of an attacking eagle and its talons threatening the victim. And when the helicopter crashed with that logo on the nose, within hours of its fatal result, before authorities could even document what happened on the set, someone came and erased the logo, which, along with Frank Marshall clearing the set immediately and other acts, in addition to the special effects men fleeing in their truck with their beer and bombs, they erase the Fly By Night, because obviously someone felt it was very embarrassing to make that admission that they were Fly By Night.
So I want to get more into the trial, but before we do that, I want to talk a little bit more about John Landis. And I just want to provide some thoughts that I had. That one of the things I found really interesting about the book and what I've read of it is the way you get into sort of Landis's background. And as we were talking about before we started recording, his sort of inner circle, these characters like I think Catherine Wooten and Joe Dante as well. Yeah. They all sort of come from the same sort of world of filmmaking, in that they all sort of come out of that Roger Corman school. And for people that don't know, Roger Corman was known for being sort of the ultimate in guerrilla B-movie filmmakers. He's just like, we got to shoot this in 6 days and we're going to do it. And he would get it done. And if you look at Landis's early films like Schlock or the Kentucky Fried Movie, he really does come from this background of, we need to shoot this film by any means necessary, and we're going to cut corners to do it. How important do you think that is to the story? Not necessarily those connections within the film world that Landis had, but maybe that mentality Landis had about, that sort of guerrilla filmmaking. We got to shoot and we got to get it done, and we got to get it done in a fast and cost-cutting manner.
Well, I mean, I think that if you want to look for a motive that is more pernicious than that, was his obsession with explosions and special effects, not concentrating on drama and interaction between actors. I mean, he was much more, that's what he was known for. Animal House was actually a departure from that. It had a story in it, and it was more of a traditional type film financed by the studios. And I think economics was more of a, I don't know, the Roger Corman thing was sort of preceded the Landis generation. Remember, they were all sort of 60s anti-war people who got into film, and they basically, apart from John Landis, who was pretty much a self-made guy. He was helped a lot by people he knew, but he didn't come right out of the big group of humorists at the time and people who contribute a lot to Hollywood filmmaking were the people from the National Lampoon, the Harvard, they called them they were, and then of course the young executives that came from that world also. They were part of that 60s generation. Corman himself, I think, rose to prominence while they were a little young. They kind of grew into it as a subsequent, they sort of came in the wake of the Corman thing.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think Dante probably had a much stronger connection to Corman than Landis.
Yeah, probably. But they were very young when Corman's prominence. They were very young. They were just entering the film world.
So for you, it's more about this sort of competition that he's having with Steven Spielberg that maybe pushes him to go too far in what he's doing.
Well, Yeah, I mean, it's the competition. Well, no, I mean, it's really this, like I said, the obsession with special effects. In the early part, in the preparation of the film, everybody who knew him was commenting about he's running around like a Groucho Marx type character, touting how big these explosions are going to be. And so he's talking the explosions, the explosions. So, basically, what happened was his film was sort of ordinary until the Lucy Fisher, who was the executive from Warner, responsible for supervising story development and the presentation of the whole script. It was not until she really proposed the incorporation of the children in there that Landis rewrote the script to bring in the helicopter. And instead of doing the shots in a studio and simulating children helicopter, he insisted on ultra reality. As one of the people said, he was too real. Everything had to be too real. In fact, Vic Morrow himself commented to one of his people on the set that in another scene where he caused a lot of discomfort for Vic Morrow, in a Vietnam scene where he was, supposed to be hiding out in the water, he had Vic Morrow stay in the water too late. Vic Morrow had some medical problems that were aggravated by this. He was having other issues, and he was really physically challenged by this. And he complained to the people. He said, "Worse the effect of this is worse than Vietnam. This is too Vietnam, too much Vietnam." So
yeah, it sounds like in a way Landis is like I've seen this used in film before. He's sort of this archetypal, the obsessed filmmaker that wants to make the best film possible, and he has to have all the best special effects, and he just has to outdo everyone. So he's a weird sort of eccentric character in that way. I guess moving from Landis to Spielberg and Warner Brothers, how do they figure into how the trial ends up going?
Well, Warner basically pays and controls everything. I mean, they don't control the attorneys, but they're paying their fees. And basically, as I describe in the book, I had access to internal Warner documents that were amazingly revealing. For example, until the book came out, no one realized that Frank Marshall, the guy who was the top executive on the set at the time of the crash, who witnessed the crash, actually picked up the little girl's dead body or dying body in the water, rushed to the helicopter crash, like many on the set did, to try and rescue either survivors who were inside the chopper or people who were underneath it. He carried the little girl's body to the shore, fled the scene, and never was seen again, never interviewed by authorities, and never had to tell about what he knew before about the illegal hiring. This fact, which you would think to be widely known, was completely concealed and only existed in the Warner interview with him. In other interviews that Warner conducted using Los Angeles's top law firm, they were able to determine the story 6 months to 9 months before the civil authorities, the prosecutor, or the police had any idea what was happening on the set. So you had Warner, rather than being a good corporate citizen, coming forward and trying to present accurate evidence to authorities to figure out what happened, concealing things and advising people about not having to testify or talk to authorities. So, you have lots of problems. As I point out in the book, why is Warner so concerned? Because if they're charged and found guilty, they would lose their license to film with children in California, which would obviously be a complete disaster for one of the top studios in the world. Same with Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg, every one of his films up until this time incorporated children themes and stories. His greatest stories were with children. So obviously, had Spielberg been convicted even of civil causes, not even criminal, he could have lost his right to film in California. So there's a lot at stake.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. I think, I think people listening to this will understand how the trial ended up panning out, where, Landis basically gets off. But real quick, I just wanted to say, I think the whole case, had it gone a different way, would have been a black mark for everyone involved, even someone who doesn't seem as who wasn't even directly involved, like a Joe Dante who filmed a different segment. I mean, the film, I think, would have cast a pretty long shadow over everyone involved with the film in a way that could have affected their careers?
Well, first of all, you must understand the first thing Landis did with his attorneys is they tried to conceal what happened, not only from the authorities, not only from the public, but more importantly, from their peers, their fellow directors. They immediately started a campaign in the Directors Guild to misrepresent what happened on the set. Most directors had no idea that what Landis did, the placement of the children, the direction of the helicopter, the placement of the explosions, the fact that the special effects crew was stoned on booze, the fact that there was widespread cocaine use. Several of the Directors Guild people, some of the directors, a small minority, who were not friendly to Landis, and of course they had great respect for Spielberg because he was the top director in the world at the time, still is, and so they were not prone to accept the recklessness that really occurred. They had no idea. So I mean, in their defense, it was only their ignorance of other professional directors, including the Star Wars people, Lucas, many of the most important directors over time, who were very agitated naturally to see this occur, because in addition to the horribleness of the deaths and the decapitations and all this, they were also concerned that the California state legislature would intervene and restrict more things in their filmmaking ability. So the directors were very concerned from that point of view as well.
I guess what I meant, though, is that this could have impeded certain careers. Like it could have easily impeded Landis's career, could have impeded Spielberg's career had it gone a different way.
Well, obviously, I mean, had they been convicted, yeah, they would have gone to jail. I mean, the judge in later interviews claimed that he was prepared to sentence Landis up to 2 years in state prison had he been convicted. But he himself, I think, found the acquittal remarkable. And I mean, the jury just didn't, well, first of all, another big story in the book is the drama of the trial itself. There were two prosecutors, one who prosecuted the case for several years but got in trouble himself, was replaced by another prosecutor, a gal named Leia De Agostino, who is a very interesting character herself, very effective, very good with the truth, but her personality and her style just repulsed the jury. And in the end, they sort of fell for the defense attorney, this fellow James Neal, the famed prosecutor, the Watergate guy, and they just thought he was great. And I believe he hypnotized them. I mean, figuratively speaking.
Well, it sounds like it's a story in which, everyone, including the parents of the children in some ways, it seems like everyone sort of falls under the allure of the Hollywood mystique or the sort of spectacle of Hollywood.
Well, obviously, this is Hollywood. I mean, as the defense attorney argued, this is, a Hollywood town, and basically told the jurors not to blame the Hollywood people for being rich and special. They took that attitude that the Hollywood people are just like you, and partially the jury believed in that. And of course, I interviewed most of the jurors. No one else did. And in the book, it ends with this kind of Twilight Zone ending about what the jurors really believed and why they believed John Landis and the other 4 defendants, that were a total of 5, should be held innocent.
Yeah, and those 5 defendants. So it's Landis, George Folsey.
Landis, George Folsey, the associate producer, the unit production manager who did all the dirty work for John Landis, all the cheap hiring, and then he of course lied like crazy, a guy named Dan Allingham. And then the 4th guy was the special effects guy.
Is that Paul Stewart?
Paul Stewart. And who am I forgetting here?
Dorsey Wingo.
Oh, Dorsey Wingo, the helicopter pilot himself, who this was his first Hollywood assignment, just to give you an example, who himself was basically very timid because he wanted to comply with John Landis's desires.
There's just a few more things I want to touch upon here. Maybe you could talk about the trial itself ends up attracting a lot of celebrities to it. Carrie Fisher was at the trial, Dan Aykroyd. Could you talk a little bit about that and whether it had an effect on anything?
Well, I don't know if you know this, but obviously Landis and his attorneys, they called all the celebrities, they invited them at the time. At the time of the trial, actually during that 5-year period from the time of the crash till it finally went to trial, John Landis was amazingly effective, successful. He did many films and projects, Thriller with Michael Jackson. He did the Trading Places, putting Eddie Murphy on the map in a big way. So Three Amigos, I mean, he despised he did film after film.
Into the Night with Jeff Goldblum.
Yeah, but I never, right. Several films, but anyway, their attorney or whoever was responsible, obviously Landis, whoever's people, invited the celebrity show up, Michelle Pfeiffer, Dan Aykroyd, Carrie Fisher, but most interestingly, because the jury tended to be on the older side, he had his two big stars from Trading Places. What's this? I can't remember the names, but they were
Ralph Bellamy and
the other the guy who played the other old man. What's his name? Anyway, so they would come to the trial constantly. Bellamy was in the hallway kibitzing with the reporters. That year the Academy Awards were coming on during the trial, and Ralph Bellamy was going to present an award or being presented an award, and he wanted Landis to do it. So they tried to work every bit of Hollywood they could. And in fact, there's a very funny interview with Eddie Murphy where he gets into a scene with John Landis after the film, after the trial, and John Landis says to him, "Hey, why didn't you show up at the trial?" And Eddie Murphy says, "Hey, look, you cut off someone's head in the trial. I'm not going to show up. You got to take your own role." And John Landis apparently tries to physically touch Eddie Murphy offensively. Eddie Murphy grabs him in a headlock and throws him on the ground and says, "Don't be messing with me." It's a good story. It's in the Playboy interview with Eddie Murphy.
So before closing out here, what can you say about the prosecution? What did they do that you think is admirable? Where do you think they may have made mistakes?
Well, I mean, it's Don Amici, by the way. Remember?
Don Amici from Trading Places. Oh my, I don't know how I.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is that Ralph Bellamy and Don Amici, being a little bit of the other generation, most people your generation probably don't even know them other than that film, if they even know that film, because that film, as you know, these films are so demographically connected. I mean, in any event, they were always in court, but you're back to your question about the prosecution. Oh, well, first of all, they direct, obviously, the top people in the district attorney's office who appoint the prosecutors for each case are very close to Hollywood themselves. As you know from the book, only one police officer, a sheriff's deputy, Sergeant Tom Buds, who's assigned to the case or who's on duty the night the call comes in that there was a crash and deaths on a movie set at 4:00 in the morning. He's the only guy investigating the case for months. When finally the DAs were appointed to prosecute the case after the grand jury indictments, they picked people who had no experience in Hollywood filmmaking. They were unable to penetrate any of the mysteries and secrets of the film or the filmmaking business. They had no idea how it worked. And when the first prosecutor on the case got into a little scandal of his own and had
Is that the prostitution scandal with the first prosecutor?
No, the first prosecutor ended up having a front page type story come out in the Los Angeles Times saying he was part owner in a downtown taxi dance, a prostitution type environment. And that was considered, a complete humiliation. Some people allege that people on the Twilight Zone defense investigated that and leaked that to humiliate the prosecution. When he resigned from the case, he was replaced by another little lady, the final prosecutor, Leia de Agostino, who, like I said, was very smart, very presentable, a great speaker, was theatrical herself, but refused to have help, wanted to do the case, wanted to showboat, in my opinion, herself, and didn't accept assistance from the case, and was a single prosecutor up against 5 defense guys who were all as good or better than she was. So the prosecution was doomed to failure from its very beginning by nature of who was assigned to the case. And I never really pursued this aspect of the case, but I'm sure you'll find somehow at the top, the people at the top, the district attorney at the time, a guy named Ira Reiner, who appointed the prosecutor, and then his assistant, Gil Garcetti, whose son is now the mayor of LA, somehow picked people who they felt would not be too offensive to Hollywood, because they themselves have manifold connections with the Hollywood executive suite.
So wrapping up here, I just had two more things. The first is, what do you think the best evidence, if there was evidence that we didn't get into in this conversation, what do you think the best evidence is for criminal negligence and sort of a multi-million-dollar cover-up? You know, I know you talk about a defense attorney seeming to create false testimony, and there's a few other things that we couldn't get into. So for you, what is the best evidence that you hope readers find out about in Fly By Night?
Well, I mean, it's not evidence alone. It's more the machinations, the maneuvers of the attorneys and the personnel and how they get people to say things and how they get filed things. But as far as the best evidence, and okay, look, one of the standards for a manslaughter conviction is that you have to have foreknowledge of the thing you're doing could result in some death or bodily damage. For example, a kid is on a skateboard and he wants to ride on the back holding the fender. And you say, okay, hold on, and I'll take you up to 50 miles an hour. Well, you could anticipate that there could be a disaster. So if the kid falls off and dies, that's grounds for a manslaughter charge because you have foreknowledge. You're able to anticipate. In addition to all the other hazards I've described, placing the kids next to explosives, hiding them from authorities, whatever, all in addition to all those things, the night of the fatal crash, there were two scenes of explosions in the helicopter. One scene was at 11:30, whereas the final crash occurred at 2:30, okay? In both scenes, the helicopter was brought out, filming was done, and explosions were set off next to it. In the second helicopter scene at 2:30, the same thing occurred, but the explosions brought down the chopper. What I point out, and which involve where the false testimony comes in and many of the machinations come in, is that first scene with the helicopter and the explosives at 11:30. In that scene, the helicopter is nearly blown out of the sky. And many people after that scene, including the pilot, the stunt director, the cameraman on the helicopter, come to John Landis and complain, hey, we were almost blown out of the sky. It was hot. There was water coming out of the explosions that hit the helicopter. Mud clouded the mirror. We couldn't see. Our chopper, the top blades almost collided with the nearby cliff. And you know what John Landis said to them? Don't be squeamish. And then in another scene, he said, you ain't seen anything yet. So after this warning, rather than adjusting that scene and moving the helicopter away, after being given clear evidence that there was danger involved, he still went ahead and caused this disaster.
But in terms of the Warner Brothers and Steven Spielberg element, what would you say there for people that may not be getting that aspect? I think people get the Landis aspect, but how does the Warner Brothers Spielberg go on?
Well, I mean, the Spielberg evidence or evidence against his knowledge, involvement, approval of the shooting of children at night illegally would have been challenged through Frank Marshall's being closely involved in the production. So had authorities been able to tie Frank Marshall to it, the assumption would have been that Spielberg knew, because they were known for collaborating and discussing everything. So it was basically, I hate to say guilt by association, but I mean, in Hollywood, the buck stops with the producer, the executive producer, legally, financially, and otherwise. If it's successful, the executive producer gets the credit. If it's a failure, the executive producer gets the credit. In this case, Spielberg was the executive producer, and there was a clear line of him possibly being tied. We were never able to prove his direct connection because Frank Marshall, as I said, fled the country and was not approachable. I described the attempt by the authorities to track down Marshall and to obtain evidence. And of course, part of the defense case for at least one of the defendants, George Folsey, was that all the Spielberg people knew all along, and therefore they shouldn't be held responsible because it was common knowledge that kids would be used.
And I just want to say, with the Frank Marshall aspect of this story, people are going to be shocked by the sort of final page, the epilogue, when they find out what happened to Frank Marshall and his response to all this. But we'll leave that to the readers. What I want to say.
I mean, you will tell the readers they can get this on Amazon and it will be delivered to them within a few days.
Yes. But I wanted to just, one more thing I wanted to touch on real briefly here was, I think this is one in a number of stories that we've seen over the years with Hollywood and cost-cutting measures and tragedies ensuing as a result. So the most recent one is Alec Baldwin in the movie Rust. But before that, we had the whole thing with Brandon Lee's tragic death on the set of The Crow, which, people say cursed films, but you have people on the set of that movie, like the actor Michael Berryman, saying that they believe it was cost-cutting measures that caused that to happen. So do you think that this case is actually maybe indicative of a wider problem in Hollywood? And that's the last question I wanted to ask you.
Well, I mean, the Rust affair also was the result of cost cutting. I don't know how closely you follow that case, but the people who were hired on that had no experience. Top professional in pistols and arms use and special effects were not hired. The gal who was responsible she'd done one other movie before. She was a total freshman, a young kid. She was directed by Alec Baldwin not to be in the church at the time where the mishap occurred. Ordinarily, the person involved is present. They're supposed to inspect the weapons. There were several misfires on the set where guns had gone off before accidentally. And of course, there were several examples of misfires where themselves were ground. Right now, the district attorney in New Mexico, in Santa Fe, has currently not decided whether to bring charges against any of the people in the Rust production. Obviously, Alec Baldwin was both a producer, the main actor, a writer, and an investor. So he has many dimensions of vulnerability in this case. He himself was outraged, he's claimed, and many of the others who are expert on saying that there shouldn't be live ammo on a set. Interesting connection to the Twilight Zone case is that in one of the incidents in the Twilight Zone case, when Vic Morrow was being filmed in the swamp, escaping the American troops in Vietnam, they wanted to fire special effects things at him that made it look like he was being fired upon. The special effects marbles didn't do the job, so they brought in live ammunition and had live shotgun blasts aimed at him, which they denied, also lied about that completely. But so there's been a long tradition. So people say to me on many occasions, what have they learned from the Twilight Zone case in terms of safety? And I say not much, because the Twilight Zone case, one of the main things, like for example, live ammunition on the set, is obviously still occurring in 2021. So obviously safety measures have been ignored. And I will point out, by the way, that in addition to the Brandon Lee death on the set, was that death 7 years ago? I forgot the name, I'll tell you in a minute, by Randall Miller, a director, a woman died on rail tracks. You remember that 7 years ago? There was a movie, big film, I got the name somewhere. Anyway, Randall Miller was the director, and he ended up going to jail for a year. First time a director went for jail.
I think the film was Midnight Rider.
Is that it? Yes, that's it.
Yes.
7 years ago, right. And he actually did a plea agreement rather than go to trial and have his wife placed on trial, because his wife was a member of the production staff and they wanted to indict her as well for participating in this deadly scene. He did a year, and he's back in Hollywood, of course, producing again. So who knows? I think in all likelihood, I mean, the Rust case had many similarities in terms of carelessness many similarities in terms of authoritarianism and many similarities on cutting corners. So who knows whether the district attorney files or not is another question. There's a lot of politics involved. District attorney there is a big Democrat. Alec Baldwin's a big Democrat supporter, very active in political affairs there. So we don't know. He's already claimed, Alec Baldwin, his brother has already claimed that if anything happens to him, it's because Trump supporters are behind it. So we don't know what's going to happen.
Out of curiosity, and I just thought of this, is there anyone that you didn't get to speak to when writing this book that you wish you could have, or like what would you say to someone like John Landis if they were to contact you about this book? Like what would you want to ask these people?
Aren't you ever going to make an apology? I mean, statute of limitations is gone. Settlements have already been made. Parents got a couple $1,000,000 each or whatever they got. It's now time to confess the truth, but he continues the big lie, which is that he didn't blow that thing up, that it was some accident pulled off by this guy 100 yards away, whatever. The reason we know this is because last year, his son has been accused of being, he's got a son, Max Landis.
Yeah, Max Landis.
His son, obviously, John's done a lot of things to promote the interest of his son. He's done some reasonably successful things in Hollywood, but sort of recently has reached a dead end in his career and has been called online by all the kids, especially on Reddit. He's been accused of being the new young Harvey Weinstein of Hollywood. He's been accused of rape, of molesting women, of abusing them, of harassing them, all kinds of horrible charges. Up to last year, he was still present on the Reddit. I'm too old to understand how that works. My kids know it. They brought it to me, and he was still claiming on Reddit that part of his deviance is related to growing up with his father, John Landis, who still to this day suffers from post-traumatic stress because he's falsely accused for something some guy did to blow up the explosions 100 yards away. So they're still promoting the myth that Landis had no responsibility, which I don't even know. I'd like the kid to read the book to see what really happened, because he was born 3 years later. John Landis's first daughter, by the way, whose name is Rachel, was in the trailer as a young baby with Deborah Nadoolman and the two hidden kids. So I don't know if she knows that. No one knows the truth until Fly By Night.
Well, I want to thank you again, Steve Chane, for coming on Parallax Views to discuss your book, Fly By Night, The Secret Story of Steven Spielberg, Warner Brothers, and the Twilight Zone Deaths. You can buy it on Amazon, or as I always recommend my listeners do, independent bookstores. Contact Trine Day and Chris Milligan. And also, I love real quick, if I could, I love the quote you have on here from the Twilight Zone trial attorney, Harlan Braun, who says,
Correct.
A tour through a sewer in a glass-bottom boat. That is how he describes the book. And it is a fascinating read. I'm still working through it, and I really am happy you joined the show.
Well,
Any last word?
Yeah, I want to make one last comment. I prefer independent bookstores, of course, but because of we're a small publisher, it's hard to get into them. It's very expensive. You have to order it there. I called one of my friends who called me to ask how to order it, not because they didn't want to use Amazon. And I said, you got to go to the bookstore. He went to the bookstore and he said his distributor had it, but it would take about 7 days to 10 days to get it. So please help support the local bookstores, who are obviously almost non-existent. I just read 70% of all book sales are online, but please support your independent bookstore. We would prefer that, or order directly from the publisher, Trine Day, TRINEDAY. Thank you.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.